So we're now at the book of Ruth, and this has been described as the book of Ruth is a brief lull in the midst of a storm. That's in that book called The Introduction to the Old Testament. A brief lull in the midst of a storm, because we just had Judges, and Judges was exciting but very depressing. You get to the end of the book of Judges and you think, what's going to happen now? And if you remember, right back at Genesis, you saw how God made man in his own image. Everything's good. They're in the Garden of Eden. Then Satan comes, tempts them. They choose to eat the fruit that God told them not to. Sin comes into the world. Everything gets messed up. Then God promises to Abraham that through his seed, there's going to be many blessings. And he tells Abraham that through Abraham and through his offspring, many people are going to get blessed. Not just Abraham's own descendants, but other people. And then we see with the Israelite people that they're put into slavery, and you think, oh, what's going to happen now? But then you see God brings them out of slavery in the Exodus, brings them into the promised land. But then you see the judges ruling people, and that doesn't work. And at the end of the book of Judges, you come to the conclusion that having judges to rule the people does not work. And you're wondering what is going to happen next. But then the book of Ruth comes, and we see that this is set in the same time period as the book of Judges. And what we see here is people actually following God loyally and how God blesses them. And you see the promises to Abraham actually coming into fulfillment in the book of Ruth. And this is right before Samuel, where again a lot of bad stuff happens. So that's why it's a brief lull in the midst of a storm. Now, a genre. Anyone want to guess what kind of genre it is?
Narrative.
Yeah, narrative. It's narrative, and it's also been called short story or novella, which is another term scholars use to talk about these kind of short stories like the book of Ruth. It's also historical, and I say that because some people try saying that the book of Ruth is made up. And they say that an Israelite made it up, or even that King David made up the story. Now, this is highly unlikely, because in the book of Ruth, what we see is that King David's great-grandmother is a Moabite. Now, the Israelites did not look on the Moabites too kindly, so it's very unlikely King David would make up that kind of story. So the question is, why would an Israelite make up having a Moabite great-grandmother? Very unlikely David made it up. Very unlikely any Israelite made up this story. To me, it adds to its authenticity the fact that in it they're claiming that a Moabite is the ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus Christ. So I believe it is historical. I see no reason to say that it would be a myth or made up. Now, the date and authorship. I'm not going to give you any answers here because there aren't really any answers. It doesn't tell you who wrote the book of Ruth. It wasn't Ruth. And it doesn't tell you at what time the book was written either. But there are some clues. For example, Ruth 1 verse 1, it says, during the time of the judges. So this tells us not only is the story set in the time of the judges, but the story is actually written by someone who is far enough in the future that they can look back and say this was during the time of the judges. So it's someone after Ruth's time who's writing about this, and they're looking back to the time of the judges. Another clue we got is Ruth chapter 4 verse 22. It says, Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. So with this information, when does it appear that the book was written? David's time or after David's time. Then we've got Ruth 4 verse 7. Now this used to be the customary way to finalize a transaction involving redemption in Israel. This is describing how Boaz acts as his kinsman redeemer. He does a ceremony where you've got to take your shoe off. Sounds a bit weird to us today. You wouldn't imagine a business meeting where someone goes, deal, and they start taking their shoe off. You'd be like, no thanks. But back in these days, that did happen. But the writer of Ruth actually refers to this as something that used to happen. So he describes it and he says, now this used to be the customary way to finalize a transaction. So again, we know that this was written quite a bit after the actual events took place. And we've also, tradition says, well, the Talmud says that Samuel wrote it, but he lived too early to write it. Most scholars these days don't agree with the Talmud that Samuel wrote it. You don't have to agree with everything that's written in the Talmud, by the way. Some people say it's possibly written by a woman because it contains women's concerns. Could also be by a man who understands where women are coming from. But it's just interesting. The book of Ruth, it does cover women's concerns. So just put that out there. I'm not saying a woman did write it. I have no problem with a woman writing it. I think some people think, what? But there's no reason really to feel that way. So that's the genre, that's the date and authorship, which I haven't helped you with at all, I know. But if the Bible don't tell us, then I'm not going to try and make something up. Let's look at the structure. You've got the introduction, which is Ruth 1, verses 1 to 5. That's the intro of the story. Then you've got what some might call Act 1, like in a play. In Act 1, you've got the Exodus. We're not talking about the Exodus that the Israelites took out of Egypt, but we're talking about the Exodus of Ruth's family. And it's chapter 1, verses 6 to 18. Then you've got Act 2, Bethlehem. They arrive at Bethlehem. This is chapter 1, verses 19, going through to 22. So when you read this, you might want to read it in these little divisions, read it in these acts. Then you've got Act 3, Boaz is introduced. This starts at chapter 2 and it goes through to verse 23. And then Act 4, you've got the plan. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 18. And then Act 5, the public pronouncement. Chapter 4, verses 1 to 12. And then it ends with the postlude. Chapter 4, 13 to 22. Nice, simple structure there to the book of Ruth. And thankfully, there haven't been any scholars out there who've tried to say this was written by a Yahwist and this was written by, and tried to make out that loads of different people wrote it, which people are obsessed with doing that with the Pentateuch. They haven't done that with Ruth, thank God. So, it's narrative. We're just going to recap on 3 principles for interpreting narratives. And these come from that book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, by Douglas Stewart and Gordon Fee. So check it out. We jump in at principle number 8. Narratives are not written to answer all our theological questions. They have particular, specific, limited purposes and deal with certain issues, leaving others to be dealt with elsewhere in other ways. Now, I mention that just so that when you approach Ruth, you're not thinking you're going to get every single answer to every theological question you've had in your life, because narratives aren't designed that way. So if you only ever had the book of Ruth your whole Christian life, you probably would be pretty stuck about a lot of issues and questions. So when you read it, don't try and, work out stuff that isn't really meant to be worked out of that book. It has its own purpose, and as we go through it tonight, we'll see what that purpose is. Point 9, this is quite important for the book of Ruth. Narratives may teach either explicitly, in other words, by clearly stating something, or implicitly, by clearly implying something without actually stating it. So in a narrative, you get some stuff which is explicit. It blatantly states something. But you get other stuff which is implicit, where when it's there, but it doesn't really state it. And if you're confused about that, we're going to look at an example in a minute. Final point, point 10. In the final analysis, God is the hero of all the biblical narratives. So if anyone asks you who's the main character of Ruth, the answer is not Ruth. The answer is not Boaz. It's not Naomi, but the answer is God. He is the hero of all the biblical narratives. So I imagine everyone's wanting me to talk about implicit and explicit, probably. So we jump into that now. Implicit teaching. Implicit teaching means it's clearly there, but it's not stated. Okay, it's a part of the teaching that is clearly there in the story, but it hasn't actually been stated. And what I want to stress here is that we don't need to search for hidden meanings. Some people want to do that. They want to search for hidden meanings in the text. But we don't need to do that. But what we do need to do instead is to look out for the things that the original listeners would have recognized. That's quite important. When you read a text, you're not saying, what secret meaning can I draw out of this? And then share that with other people. That sounds really exciting. We don't want to do that. What we do want to do is say, okay, for the Jewish listeners who are hearing this story, what things would they recognize as obvious in the text? Stuff that I'm not going to recognize today. Here's an example. Ruth's conversion. You might not have ever heard anyone say that before. You might not have heard people talk about Ruth's conversion. But to a Jew, this would have been really obvious when you read this bit. Ruth 1, verse 16. But Ruth replied, and she says this to Naomi, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Now, almost my whole life, I've heard this verse in the context of, look what a great friend Ruth was to her mother-in-law. But as a Jew reading this, you're reading about a Moabite woman here, and she says, your people will be my people. She's saying, I'm not going to be a Moabite anymore. I'm going to be one of your people. I'll be an Israelite. And she says, and your God will be my God. I'm not going to follow the Moabite God. I'm going to follow your God. I think the Moabite God was called Chemosh. And so here what you've got is Ruth converting. And that's quite significant. When you hear people say, oh, Jesus' ancestor was a Moabite, that's a bit, ooh. Remember that she actually decided to convert and to become an Israelite. So yes, she is a Moabite, but she converts into God's people. Another thing that's implicit and not explicit is Boaz. Boaz is faithful to God. I don't think there's a verse in Ruth that says, hey, Boaz was very faithful to God. But you pick it up as you read it. Check this out, yeah? Ruth chapter 2, verse 4. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. May the Lord be with you. They replied, may the Lord bless you. Now, as an Israelite reading this, you're aware that it's the time of the judges. We know in the time of the judges, people did what they saw right in their own eyes. Everyone did what they thought was right, not what God thought was right. And then suddenly you see this guy called Boaz who's greeting people saying, may the Lord be with you. And you also see the other people in Bethlehem are saying, may the Lord bless you. So that's an implicit thing where you're like, Boaz is a guy who's faithful to God when the rest of Israel doesn't seem very faithful. Then you got Ruth 2, verse 12. This is what Boaz says to Ruth. May the Lord reward your efforts. May your acts of kindness be repaid fully by the Lord God of Israel, from whom you have sought protection. Now here, what you've got going on is Boaz using theology from the book of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy 28 verse 2 says, all these blessings will come to you in abundance if you obey the Lord your God. So what you've got happening with Boaz is he knows that God said if you obey him, you will be blessed. And so he's responding to Ruth in this way because he sees Ruth obeying God. And so he's like, may you be blessed. So again, something implicit here that Boaz is a good follower of the Lord. And check this one out. Ruth 2 verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my dear. Do not leave to gather grain in another field. You need not go beyond the limits of this field. You may go along beside my female workers. Does anyone know what's going on here? He's protecting her and he's following the law. Levitical law says this. Leviticus 19 verses 9 to 10. When you gather in the harvest of your land, you must not completely harvest the corner of your field, and you must not gather up the gleanings of your harvest. You must leave them for the poor and the foreigner. So this was a principle they had in the law, was, hey, don't use up all your land. Leave bits at the edges so that the poor people and the foreigners from other countries, like a Moabite called Ruth, can come along and they can get food. That would be like today saying, hey, when you get your money at the end of the month, just leave some on your front doorstep of your door. And then if any poor people or any Somalians come into the country, they can take some and they won't be poor. That wouldn't really happen today. People wouldn't do that. But back then, you've got Boaz doing that. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to leave stuff at the edges of my fields so that people like Ruth can have it. Now, what we also notice is that not everyone was following this law, because check it out, right? Naomi says to Ruth in chapter 2, verse 22, "It is good, my daughter, that you should go out to work with his female servants. That way you will not be harmed, which could happen in another field." So we see that in other fields, it would have been quite dangerous to do this. Something bad could have happened to Ruth. So not everyone followed the law, but what is implicitly taught in the scripture is that Boaz was faithful to God. So it's not explicit, you won't find a verse there, but reading it, you should be able to see, this guy is following God. And notice a lot of this stuff is in speech marks. Okay, so it's that whole thing of when in narration, in Hebrew narrative, they put stuff in speech marks to give you characterization, to show you what the person's character is like. Now, another thing that's implicit is Bethlehem was faithful to God. Now, that's significant because where was Jesus born? Bethlehem, yeah. And it shows us here, long before Jesus was born, that back in the time of the Judges, Bethlehem was faithful to God. You got Ruth 4, verse 11. "All the people who were at the gate and the elders replied, 'We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your home like Rachel and Leah, born of whom built up the house of Israel.' Both of whom built up the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem." So here we see that the people are acknowledging God. They're using God to bless people. We also saw how earlier when Boaz greets people, then they return with a blessing to him as well. So you can see that the people in Bethlehem are honoring God at this strange, dark time of the Judges. Then you got verse 14. "The village women said to Naomi, 'May the Lord be praised because he has not left you without a guardian today. May he become famous in Israel.'" So you see the women there are into God. They are following God. Interesting as well that they pray, "May he become famous in Israel." And Ruth's great-grandson ends up being King David. Another thing that's implicit is what I just said. David's great-grandmother was a foreigner. So you got Ruth 4, 21 to 22. Boaz, you got a genealogy right at the end of Ruth, and it says, "Boaz was the father of Obed, Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David." So those are implicit things in the text. So when you're studying the Bible, don't look for secret stuff, but go through it saying, okay, what would the original listeners get out of this text? And that's why it's so good to not read Ruth until you've read the Pentateuch, because you've already got that backdrop. And it's good to read Judges before you read Ruth, because then you've already got that backdrop. So it's much easier to understand Ruth the way the original listeners would understand it. Now, let's look at the themes in the book. First big theme I want to look at is the contrast to the book of Judges. Huge contrast. In Judges, we saw people doing what they saw right in their own sight, people turning away from God and sporadically turning back to God, led by judges who were local leaders. They weren't national leaders like Moses was. And what we see in the book of Ruth is loyalty to Yahweh. We see people being loyal to Yahweh, and we see people being loyal to the covenant. And it's really nice to see that after reading the book of Judges. Another theme we see is emptiness to fullness. Emptiness to fullness. Ruth starts off in chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. It says, "During the time of the Judges, there was a famine in the land of Judah." So the story writer, who's excellent at telling stories, pictures a famine. Straight away in your head, you've got this idea of emptiness. And then check out what it says about Naomi. "Then Naomi's two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died." Got even more emptiness. So the woman was left all alone, bereaved of her 2 children as well as her husband. Very empty. And throughout the book, you'll notice stuff about emptiness and fullness. And in the end, in Ruth 4 verse 17, it says, the neighbor women named him, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. Now he became the father of Jesse, David's father. So it ends with fullness. In the end, this woman, where everything was completely empty, now it's as if, wow, she's got it all. She's full. And you'll see that in other stuff that's written. It's quite descriptive and it's quite interesting. Then you got God's providence. In Ruth chapter 2 verse 3 it says, so Ruth went and gathered grain in the fields behind the harvesters. Now she just happened to end up in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now there it says it just happened. She just happened to end up in Boaz's area. Now it's not really saying, oh, look at that, what a coincidence. What it's saying is God has arranged this. And you see that in the book of Ruth. You see God, his providence is at hand. He's making stuff happen. So when you read the book of Ruth, it really increases your faith about God and about the hand he plays in our life. That a woman like Ruth, a Moabite, God would even make it so that she just happened to be in the right place at the right time so that she could meet Boaz and that he could redeem her and her family and their land. So God's providence is a big theme here. We see God rescue Elimelech's family. And he does it a way that a lot of non-Christians would think was just luck. But I don't think that's the way the narrator wants us to view it. It's God's providence. And it makes you wonder how many things have happened in our lives that we thought were coincidence, but was actually God causing us to be in the right place at the right time. And following on from that, we got the theme of redemption. We got Boaz follows the law of taking care of a relative's widow. Again, something that if you've read the Pentateuch, you're familiar with. When someone died and they left a widow, that person's brother would then have to take care of them. And we see here that Boaz redeems Ruth and her land. So we got a pattern here. This is something God put into the fabric of Israelite society, this whole idea of redemption. So it makes a lot of sense that later God would send his own son and redeem us. Then you got the promised seed. In Ruth 4:14, the village women said to Naomi, may the Lord be praised because he has not left you without a guardian today. May he become famous in Israel. And like I said, King David and Jesus come from Ruth's family. And back in Genesis, right after the fall, God tells Eve, that it's through her seed is going to defeat Satan. So it's just interesting that already here in the book of Ruth, you see this beginning to happen. You see the line of David taking shape. But realize this didn't happen easily, but only by God's providence. The same way as with Isaac and Jacob. None of these guys had easy births. You know, it's all stuff that has happened by God's providence. So that also tells us something about Christianity, how stuff doesn't always happen easily. A lot of stuff that's happened in the history of the church has been very, very difficult. Anyone know how the Vikings got saved? Vikings got saved by killing loads and loads of Christians. All the monasteries off the coast of Scotland got destroyed by the Vikings. Those monks got sold as slaves. And slowly, those monks and Christian girls started making an impact on their captors. And eventually you had Vikings becoming Christians. But it took thousands of martyrs for that to actually happen. Right, now, another theme, a foreigner being in God's people. A foreigner being God's people. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because back in Genesis 12, when God's talking to Abraham, in verse 3 he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham was told that all peoples on the earth would be blessed through him. And we see in the book of Ruth a Moabite being blessed through Abraham, ultimately being blessed through the Israelite people. And that just brings us to, as we close, just to remember the 3 levels of Hebrew narrative. You've got your individual stories at one level. So you've got there's a bit where Ruth asked Boaz to marry her. That's an individual story. Anyone remember what the next level is? That's right, cycles. You got cycles. Okay, and you could say that there's a cycle of Boaz becoming a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Something that was, outlined in the law. And now we see it actually happen. You've got this cycle, you've got a collection of stories that fit together that tell of Boaz actually becoming the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. So that's your cycle. Anyone remember what the last level is? Meta-narrative. The meta-narrative, the whole big story of, well, how does this fit into... Basically, you look at the individual story. Ruth asked Boaz to marry her. Then you say, how does that fit into the cycle? Well, it's all part of Boaz becoming a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. But then you say, well, how does that fit into the meta-narrative? The big story of what God's doing. And the meta-narrative is God's universal plan of bringing in Jesus to redeem mankind. And we see how the cycle fits into the meta-narrative, because from Boaz becoming the kinsman redeemer for Ruth, they're going to end up having a child that will have a child that will have a child that will be David. Maybe there's one more child in there. And then after many more children, there will be Jesus. And he will die on the cross for our sins. So that's how it fits in with the meta-narrative. Furthermore, you get a Moabite being brought into God's people. So that means for us, for Gentiles, non-Jews, we can look at this and be like, wow, that's an example for us about how we can be God's people, even though we're not Jews. We can convert, just like Ruth did. We can do that because of Jesus. And this is all part of the big story, the meta-narrative. And as you read Ruth, you can get really excited, realizing that this is our history, seeing how God has provided for us to be saved. And God's big plan and his providence in doing it. Ruth being in that field was not just luck. God knew before the creation of the world that that was going to happen. It's quite deep. And it also shows us God's patience. Shows how long God can wait for stuff to happen. You might think, why didn't he just give us Jesus straight away? But God can wait long enough to see Naomi widowed and to see them living in famine. And then he can wait long enough to watch her in the fields when, as you're reading it, you might be thinking, well, when are they going to get married? And God has all the time in the world, as it were. And he can patiently wait. He's got his timing locked. He knows what's going to happen. It all fits in with the meta-narrative, God's universal plan. So this story should give us much more faith in God and much more trust in him, that his timing is good and his provision's good. So that's Ruth. Sources that I use that are worth checking out is the Introduction to the Old Testament by Dillard and Longman, How to Read the Bible Book by Book by Fee and Stewart, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart, Word Biblical Commentary on Ruth by F.W. Bush, and the Expositor's Bible Commentary on Ruth by Huey F.B. Jr. F.B. Huey Jr. When I referred to the Expositor's Bible Commentary, by the way, there was a book I showed you, which is like the condensed one too. You can actually get a full 12-volume set as well, which goes even more in depth. And those are the ones I'm quoting, but the condensed one's really good as well. So that's Ruth. Have fun reading that, and then we'll do 1 Samuel, which will also be exciting. I'll just pray. God, I just thank you for your providence, your goodness. I just thank you for what you did with Ruth, God, and just causing her to be in that field at the right time, in the right place, so that she would meet Boaz, and that not only from that would you bless Naomi and bless Ruth, but it means that we can be blessed today as well, because ultimately from that marriage came your own son who you sent to us. So I thank you for your providence. Pray that you'd open our eyes to help us see your providence in our lives as well. Protect us, God, from thinking everything's coincidence. Give us wisdom, Lord, and help us to understand your word as we read it. Amen.